being up here. Okay, so we're about to start chapter 9, even though we went over a little bit of chapter 9 of Genesis last week. So chapter 9. So just as a reminder, when God created the things that he created, including man, all things were what according to his perception? All things that he created were good, right? But that didn't last for very long because God gave man free will. And when man has free will, we see even from the very beginning, man will choose against what God has decided for him to do. And we see that exponentially compounded to the point where God had once had a perfect creation. Now there was just 8 people that were good and righteous in his sight. And so all the other things of the world in a human form were bad because of their choice. And we noted last week and the week before that God decided to destroy those things that were wrong with man's decision and start again with Noah and his family. So this morning we're talking about after the flood. Noah was released from the ark, and after over a year of being on the ark with the animals, and God protected all of them and saved them through the flood. And they came out, and the first thing that Noah did was to worship God because of his protection and care during that very long time that I'm sure was very, it brought a lot of terror upon even him, seeing all the destruction, the catastrophic destruction that we see happen to the world in general. Just the face of this earth was scarred from a physical standpoint. But God protects his people, and that's what we learn. So we see the devastation of sin to something that God created perfect. But then we see the destruction even to things that extend away from that person. So the animals didn't sin, the earth didn't sin, but they bore the scars of sin, right? So we come to chapter 9, and this is after they've come back out of the ark, so there's just 8 people left, right? And so the question in if you have your book, it's lesson 3. It's on the second page of lesson 3, and we'll start in question 16. It says, what did Noah and his family have to do after the flood? So usually Greg answers these questions, but I'm going to ask you, what did they have to do? And God gave them an instruction after the flood. Be fruitful and multiply, right? So that's the first thing he told him to do in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So their job once again was to fill the earth. This wasn't a new command. This wasn't the first of that command. We see in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28, when God was speaking to Adam and Eve, that was his command to them. And God created man in his own image in chapter 1, verse 27. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, and he created them. God blessed them. He just blessed Noah and his sons. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over it. And so this is exactly the same command that God gives Noah and his sons here. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. For the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast. So once again, man will rule over the animal kingdom. Animals will be fearful of man. And man is supposed to multiply and fill the earth. And we'll see the issue with God gives man instruction to do certain things, but just a couple of chapters later, a couple of generations later, we see them not once again fulfilling God's command to fill the earth. And we'll talk about that possibly in just a little while. So, at the very beginning, there's 2 humans. They needed to fill the earth. Now we have 8, so it can be accomplished. God tells them to do something. God gives instructions, and he doesn't ever give man instructions that they can't accomplish, right? God doesn't tell us to do things that we can't accomplish. From Adam and Eve, the earth was beginning to be filled until it was filled with sin and had to be destroyed. From 8 souls, God's plan was to fill the earth, and it will do what God's plan was. God's plan will be fulfilled. So in question 17, we're asked what permission is given for the first time after the flood. Everything, right? So what did he initially give man for food?
Well, evidently, before this time, even the animals probably was all vegetarian.
Right. So in Genesis 1:29, that's in the garden, God said to Adam and to Eve, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which the fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you." And it also goes on to state that it'll be food for the animals as well. So in Genesis, going back to our context, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 3, it says, "Every moving thing that is alive for you shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant." So even in verse 3, he reminds them he initially gave them the green plant to eat. Additional, the animals that move along and that move about, that we are allowed to eat the fish and the birds and everything else.
It says that the fear of animals would be fear of man. Evidently, that wasn't the case before the flood either.
Right.
Everything probably mingled together, and man.
There was a fear to be had from an animal and man perspective, probably because man wasn't trying to overtake the animal or kill the animals as well. So, okay, so they're allowed to eat the flesh of birds and other animals, but there's a restriction placed upon that. Can they do everything that they want? Can they eat every part of that animal that we see here? No, Miss Carol. What was the restriction? Not to eat the blood, right? So in Genesis 9, verse 4, it says, "Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." So we see a correlation between life and blood here, right? And going even further to Leviticus in chapter 17 and verse 14, this is in the law, and the Israelites given instructions of what they should do and shouldn't do. In Leviticus 17 and verse 14, it says, "For as for the life of all its flesh," and he just in verse 13 talked about if you find an animal that's been killed or been torn apart, or you've gone and hunted and found and killed an animal, this is what you're restricted on. In verse 14, "For as for the life of all flesh, its blood is identified with its life." So that's the way the New American Standard puts it, and that's what I read from. "Therefore I say to the sons of Israel, you are not to eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off." So, obviously we see this command wasn't restricted. We're in what we would call the patriarchal age, where God speaks to the fathers. There was a restriction placed put upon blood. We just read in Leviticus, talking about the law, that there was a restriction placed upon blood, eating blood. And can you think of it? In the New Testament, is there anything in the New Testament in regards to eating blood?
When they met in Jerusalem, that was one of the things they just talk about. Nothing strangled, not drink blood, abstain from
Fornication, right. So, Tom mentioned in what some people call the Conference of Jerusalem, which is not really a conference, but when they came together to talk about circumcision and the requirement of going to the law before you becoming obedient to the law before becoming a Christian, the letter that was recommended to be sent to the Gentiles didn't put any restrictions on them in regards to keeping the law in general. There was a recommendation that they abstain from things such as what Tom said, from fornication, from things strangled, and from the blood. And many times we see in the pagan worship, they would participate in the drinking of blood in that worship service and those kind of things. But God considers blood as very important, right? Because it signifies life. And as we even think about the animals that the Mosaic law required them to sacrifice, it wasn't just a thing not to care about when those sacrifices come. That person would have to slit that animal's throat, and that blood would be poured out, and that animal would perish. It was meaningful it should have been meaningful to the Israelites, because that animal life was extinguished, and it was extinguished because of their sin. So that the blood represents something very valuable to God. And if we think even further into the New Testament, and ultimately that the plan that God had made from the very beginning, even before the foundation. God knew what man would do, and God planned that his Son would come and shed that valuable blood. We have valuable blood, but think about the blood that was in deity, that God took on, and that blood was shed, not because of him or any problem that he had, but because of our sin. We think about God's value upon life in general, and specifically blood represents that life. So, Tina.
In that Acts 15 where it talks about telling the Gentiles to restrain from things strangled or restrain from blood and everything, sometimes we think about that being the law given to the Jews, but it looks like right here that was the law given, to Noah, and he was not. You wouldn't consider him a Jew.
Yeah.
So,
No, he was in the patriarch. He wasn't under the law of Moses.
Right.
So all laws, except for the one in Acts, is directed to the Gentiles. But it almost seems like everybody else, the Jews, would know not to have done it. Jewish Christians would know not to have done that, and the Gentiles would be instructed not to do that, specifically because it was participating in the pagan worship that they were accustomed to. So they needed to be as far away from that as possible. But in general, it is something that, because of what it represents, should not be, we shouldn't consider it lightly and just think of it as food. It represents life to God. And so it's very important. And then because of the importance of that blood, and even in animals, but God goes on to talk about kind of an institution or a punishment set upon an institution of a punishment set. What do we see in verses 5 and 6 in chapter 9? Something that's not specifically stated before, and it might be the first punishment for a crime given to this extent. What do we see in regards to shedding blood and shedding man's blood? What is the punishment we see here? Capital punishment, right? So here in verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood should be shed. For in the image of God he was made. So something so special that God created in man. We're allowed to kill the animal because God gave it to us for food. But man was created in God's image. We're very special in that regards. We have his image in us, and when we shed man's blood, this is where the requirement is set for man to be shed. Man's blood can be shed by other men for that specific reason. And going back, even when Cain shed his blood, shed Abel's blood, we see his punishment wasn't death at that time. His punishment was a hard life of difficulty and sweat and toil and problems. But here we see the capital punishment we see instituted from here on. And we see this also reiterated later on. Even when Peter picked up his sword and was defending Jesus at the time in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, if you live by the sword, you shall die by the sword in the same manner. If you think if you live by bloodshed, that's how you'll ultimately die as well. That's the cost of that way of life. So obviously it's very important, this institution, we should respect the man as a creation because it's in God's image. Any comments or questions so far for the first few verses? Okay. So we talked about this last week, so I don't plan to get into it very in depth, but your question 18 is, what covenant did God make with Noah and ultimately with mankind during this chapter? The rainbow covenant, when you see the rainbow, it should remind us of the covenant that states what? I couldn't hear you, but
Never destroy the earth by water.
Never destroy the earth by water again. And that's very important because, and the rainbow comes after rain, which reminds us of water, and that should remind us that the water will never destroy the earth again. However, in question 19, it says, will the world ever be destroyed again? And we can say definitely not by water, right? But what will it be destroyed with the next time? By fire, right? And where do we find that told to us? Flaming fire. He'll come back with flaming fire, and more specifically to the physical world and all the elements. Where does that talk about? You remember where that talks about it? 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10, 11, 12, 13. So it talks about the day of the Lord will come back with like a thief in the night. The heavens will pass away. We spoke about this. Mr. Hampton spoke specifically about it. The people saying that no, it's just going to be, purified. But all of these words represented here in 2 Peter chapter 3 will pass away, and the elements will be destroyed. And that's a true gone, be taken away completely with an intense heat. Of the earth and its works will be burned up. And that's a warning then. He says, because of these things, how should we act, right? We should be acting in holiness and righteousness, following God's word. Just like the warning, that rainbow should remind us that God won't ever destroy the earth again to us. But it also should kind of remind us why the earth was destroyed initially, right? And it's because of sin of man. And we should think about that. Why did God have to destroy the earth? And that should, as all things, as we look to the heavens and its beauty, and we see his handiworks, we can look to the rainbow and see the beauty of the rainbow and the promise of not destroying the earth with water, but it also should remind us of what sin does. Not only to mankind, but to our own lives. And it should affect us in the right way, where we'll be obedient to God. And just like in 2 Peter chapter 3, we should be living in holy conduct when we think about all of these things, about the righteousness of God, about his blessings he bestows upon us, and about the destruction that's coming and the punishment we can receive. So all of this points to obedience to God, glorifying his name while we're on the earth. I'm probably going to skip on over the rainbow part unless anybody else has any comments in regards to the rainbow or what it means. Okay. All right, so in question 20, it says, name the sons of Noah. If I send up, we talk about this a lot up in the drill class, but who can name the sons of Noah? Anybody want to try it? Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? And we start seeing them here noted, and we're getting specifics about them and their activities with their father, and we see it doesn't take very long before sin rears its ugly head again, right? We saw what happened because of sin just very recently, and we see that it doesn't take long for a man to just fall back into that trap. In questions 21 and 22, I'm going to kind of combine these because I try to make a point out of it. I hope it works well. But first of all, it asks, what sin did, let's talk about Noah's sin. What sin did Noah commit? Or really, it could, I think, have a sins with an S on the end of it. But what sin did Noah commit, or sins? Tom? He got drunk, right? So it seems like he started to become a farmer. I'm not sure if he wasn't a farmer before, but he started to, obviously with only 8 people, you're not going to have bartering systems or trade. You got to do what you got to do. So he planted a vineyard. He started growing things. And he drank of the wine, and he got drunk from it. And what was the result? What happened when he went into his tent? I think there probably was, because of his sin of drunkenness, he exposed himself, right? He was uncovered. His nakedness should shown. And so that was the sin of Noah, but now it's compounded. So how did Ham dishonor his father? And how could you explain that? How Ham dishonored his father in this way?
He went in the tent and saw his father's nakedness, and then he went and told his 2 brothers.
Right. So whether he went on there by mistake or he shouldn't have gone in there in general, that I don't think was the problem as much of him going in and seeing it and then going and telling his brothers. He put shame on his fathers by going and telling his brothers about it. Guess what I saw? Guess what I saw about Dad, What was the reaction of the other two brothers? We see what should have been done, or the care that should have been taken because of it. How did they react when they heard of it? They covered him up, right? And they took precaution, right? They didn't even want to turn around and see it. They put on garments. They went in backwards. They laid it over so they wouldn't see it. They took precautions when they knew sin was around. And Ham seemed to just be not caring about this situation and not caring about his father. So we see what the reaction of sin should be. It was shameful. We knew nakedness is shameful, and even shameful to the sons that they didn't want to see it at all. And so they took precautions when sin was exposed, so they didn't get involved in it as well. So some of the lessons that we learned from this incident, well, I'll ask you first. I've got a couple, but what can we learn from this incident? Kelly?
It's an important lesson to know how to dress in our homes in front of our children.
Yeah, I think that's right. We can to have the same problem, right? In case we think we're at home, the doors are closed, nobody outside our family can see us. But people inside our family are very important too, right? Because obviously when Ham shouldn't have seen his nakedness, and we can dress in accordance where we are not showing that with our family, and it doesn't influence them to do that at home or other places as well. So absolutely, that kind of teaches us that. Yancey?
Noah was responsible for the sin of his son Ham, but we see that Ham was responsible for his own sin.
Right.
So, we can't just lay sin off on somebody else. When we sin, we're responsible.
Absolutely. Noah had sin involved. And another thing, so Noah sinned. Noah had influence on his son to sin, but we see that Ham's sin was his responsibility. He still required punishment for it. And unfortunately, so my first point was our sin has impact on others. So Noah's sin has impact on others. There was a temptation set before all of his sons to do wrong. One son fell into that temptation, Ham. The other two didn't. They were not guilty in that matter. But then sin has consequences as well. All sin has consequences, even the sin of the son. Tom?
Some indication there that, Canaan has influence, in part in there, because there's other places that talk about the sin of the father and not being the son, but here it looks like, the curse was against Ham's son, not Ham.
Yeah, well, we see Edom, though, like Esau, it's the same situation where the older would serve the younger. So my other one was sin has consequences that are far-reaching, too. So we don't know. It seems Canaan might possibly, I don't know if there's guilt shared across that or what, but we know that sin has consequences that are far-reaching. They're far-reaching for us in our own lives. And not immediate either, so the consequences aren't immediate. We sometimes hear the world talk about, somebody says something really bad or egregious, and somebody moves away from them saying, I don't want to stand next to you because you're going to get struck by lightning or something like that. Well, sin doesn't work that way. Many times, we think because we're not struck, or that person who says, I said it, I'm not struck by lightning, I can keep doing those kind of things. Well, God doesn't work that way, right? Sin doesn't always have consequences. Just because we don't receive the consequences now doesn't mean it's ever going to come. And so Ham ultimately is given a curse set upon his, as opposed to a blessing, that God gives the blessings to all of them, to all the sons and to Noah. But then Abraham gives the curse because of the attitude of the father of that clan and its ultimate reach into his offspring or his descendants. So those are some of the things I think we learned from it. Did I miss a hand? Tina?
Well, I was thinking when his other two sons took precautions not to see, that we need to do that too. I mean, it's hard to go anywhere now that you don't see that mess. You can't hardly go to Walmart, Kroger, anywhere, but you don't have to linger on it.
Right.
You don't have to let your attention be drawn to that. And,
Right.
and just things, we can't help what we see when we go somewhere, and we have to go buy groceries, I understand that, but we don't have to invite it into the home. So
Right.
It's our job to, you know, people used to say, well, you could look as long as you don't touch, like it was fine, you know, to look or whatever, but it's not fine.
No. And Jesus obviously talks about that. It's the intentions of our heart that can condemn us as well. So, yeah, absolutely, we have to make precautions to sin. And we have to make sure that we don't linger upon it or don't say, oh, well, as long as I'm not just participating in it, I can watch it on TV all I want. But guess what? That has a true effect on your heart. And we can become callous to it, and ultimately soon we'll be participating in it. J.D.?
I mean, I think one thing it tells us is, you know, sometimes we come upon situations where we see or hear things that, you know, we didn't intend to try to see or hear, but we should be very careful about
How we-
what we go off and our reaction to it, what we go off
Right.
and share, or if we try to solve a problem, or
Yeah, absolutely right. The sharing with others too. That sounds like a major issue that he went and told about it. He told his brothers obviously the details he shouldn't have told them. But yeah, we should, if we're there, we see something, we should react in the appropriate way, and it would also tells us about how we interact with others after the fact of that too. So. Okay, any other comments in regards to this sin or the sins that were committed here and its effect? Okay, so we come to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is one of those chapters that when you're sitting in your daily Bible reading, it's kind of hard. It's like, oh boy, that's a lot of commas and a lot of names, and some of those names are kind of hard, and maybe we'll just skip it in reading it, which is not so necessary, but really, I think chapter 10 is an amazing chapter, and I think the author I'm not sure who wrote the questions, but question 23 is, what is the importance of chapter 10? Why is it important, just besides a list of names? Anybody have an idea? So what is it? What is the list of names? Who do they represent? Okay, Tom?
Genealogy.
Genealogy?
Goes back to the first promise or indication Messiah was that, through your seed, all nations will be blessed.
Right.
Or that he would destroy Satan.
Right.
So it comes down, we start looking at it from Adam and Eve, you come down, you get to Noah, and then Noah, you get to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and out of Shem, you come through, start coming down, and then Abraham comes out of that, and then you come out of there, Judah and David, and down to Christ. So you've got this whole lineage that the Bible goes in
Provides
and
to
traces that. That's the path line we're going. The others, Ham and Japheth, we don't hear a whole lot more about after we get past this here. We see the Canaanites come back into,
The picture.
descendants of Shem there, and then we see, other places with the Romans and things, Japheth comes into play. So, it's there, but the specifics is down through Shem, and that traces to Christ.
I think, J.D., did you have anybody, did you have a comment?
Oh, I'm just gonna say, these people are real.
Absolutely.
Definitions of them. They're real individuals, so.
Do you remember the promise that, Joan?
It also is showing us that what God told them to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, I think that's a big reason too. And we can trace it all the way, but trace our Christ genealogy through this as well. And I'm not sure. Let me see if I have I'm not sure. So, the listing of all these people and the sons, I think it goes a long way in regards to, and it's probably too small for you to see, but this is, if you take the names that were given in this chapter, and you start putting them in to where they ultimately did go. And so God's instruction to multiply and fill the earth ultimately is going to come true, because guess what? That's what God wants to happen. And it's amazing. This is unique in just literature that we have this record of how it occurred, how we got to these places in the world, and where did these people come from. And there's no other list that we have in literature or any other kind of man's writing that would give us this, but God gives us this, and we can say, from this lineage we see these offsprings, and these offsprings went to these places, and because of these places, we read about from Canaan and Ham, all of those that we read about when they're going into the land, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all those people came about from Ham, right? And we can place them here. And ultimately, there's a bunch of lines that go even up to Italy and Spain, and we have people going into Asia. So God's instructions, God's will be accomplished. And this is one way it's done. So all those people that we read about later, and just as a reminder, this chapter encompasses the time after chapter 11, because in each one after they talk about Japheth, in verse 5, it says, from these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, according to their nations. So this encompasses after what we read about in the next chapter, because in the next chapter we read one language. So this is a far-reaching genealogy and time period, because these go all the way to the time of the Israelites and what they have to do to inherit the kingdom, and the kingdoms that people of God come in contact with for many years to come. So it's an amazing list, because we know the history of the world. Like somebody writes, let's talk about the history of the world. Well, guess what? We have one. We don't have all the history of all the world and of all the people, but we know generally how people got to these places, and that's because God's desire and his command. Anything else in regard? We're not going to read chapter 10, but we see how there ultimately will be spread later on. Some of them we don't know about, but this goes to a lot of different places on this map. And sorry it's so small, but I tried to make it as big as possible. But anything else about chapter 10? Okay, so we're moving on. I think that's all I had. The question, there was a question I wanted to cover. Question 25 says, what bearing does this chapter 10 have on our attitudes towards other nationalities or races? Or how should it influence our thinking? Right. So, we can't base discrimination on races or on where we live or on who we're related to, because guess what? We all came from Noah, right? We all came from Adam. We're all descended from one person. So races are thinking that we might be better than others because of the way we look or who we're related to should not come into play at all, because God considers all men valuable enough to send his son to save, and we should consider all. And just as a reminder, what verses in the New Testament talk about God's partiality or not showing partiality? Do you remember? God is no respecter of persons, Dale?
Also, there, chapter talks about the different families, different lands, different languages, different nations, spread them out.
Right, it spreads them out. So what was, in the New Testament, in the period of the church, what was the initial problem with discrimination? What we think about in Tom?
One was, those Judaizing Jews or that were Hebrew Jews, and those that were Hellenistic Jews, those were from other parts of the
Right.
world. Basically, the Greek culture,
Jews as
the Greek
opposed-
Jews,
right.
that was a problem. And then when it came down to the Gentiles, there was a problem there, because even with Samaria, there was a big conflict in that area.
Right.
And then with the other Jews, they were wanting to take and impose the Jewish law on the Gentiles that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Right.
So there was a lot of things there that came in. When Paul's teaching, he went through and he talked about a lot of the nationalities and different problems with various different ones that, how their cultures impacted their ability to to learn and comprehend what God's will was, and with the gospel, they were all the same in there, whether
Right.
Greek or barbarian.
Right, and many, Acts chapter 10 is the big one, when Peter finally realizes that, you know, it finally comes to him when he sits down and Cornelius talks to him about what God had done for him, about sending the angel and asking him to come. In Acts 10:34, opening his mouth, Peter said, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality in regards to race or where you live or who you are, but the one who fears him. It all comes down to what we do and what we act like. In Romans 2:11, there is no partiality with God in regards to Greek or Jew. In 1 Peter 1:17, all of these talk about the same thing. 1 Peter 1:17, if you address the Father, so God, the one who impartially judges, so there's no partiality in judgment, but he impartially judges according to each man's work. That's what God discriminates on, is what we do and how we react to his will. So that's really the lesson we need to learn from all this. God doesn't care about who you are, where you come from, who you're related to, what. It's what are you doing in regards to obeying his will. And we're all free to do that. There's no restriction. We can do it. God allowed us the ability to obey him no matter what comes our way. We can overcome any temptation. What do we do about it? So that's what it really comes down to. All right, any other comments before we move to chapter 11? Yes, Sarah.
Talking about these descendants and how we can learn from them. You know, it says that the sons of Cush or the sons of Ham served Jacob and Shem.
Right.
But the descendants of Ham were the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Canaanites. Well, the Hebrews actually served them for
Right.
much of the history of the Jews.
Right.
So I think it's almost like a prophecy about the fact that way down there with Jesus.
Right. Because it wouldn't make complete sense in regards to some of those, the Babylonians. Canaanites ultimately would serve under David and Solomon for a period of time. But it also shows the conditional nature of promises as well, that when you get a promise from God, it's conditional on your obedience, and you could be reversed in regards to that. But ultimately, yes, these nations will ultimately serve under Christ. Yes, Mr. England. Yes, Mr. England.
You know, you're talking about the sons of Noah. Jesus came through the lineage of Shem, and the black people came through the lineage of Ham, and all the other races came through the lineage of Japheth.
That's right. And it's just interesting that we can see the beginnings of that here. So in chapter 11, remember we see chapter 10 kind of overlaps chapter 11. But at the very beginning, you know, God created man. He created all of, when we look at nature and we look at the skies above, it declares his handiwork. It gives glory to God. When we see man was made in order to worship God, and obey God, and to give him glory. Everything that God's created should ultimately glorify God by obeying him. He gave instructions to man to fill the earth, right? And so we should be desiring to obey him, spread out, and from all people in all places, we're now sending forth the glory of God. But we see in chapter 11 that the attitude of these people were to disobey. In the first, let me see. Why did the people want to build a tower in chapter 11? What were a couple of reasons that they said? Right, so God's instruction was to spread and to scatter and to fill the earth. Their idea was to settle. Let's look at this land. I'm going to stay here. We all can talk one language. And instead of us spreading and glorifying God, we're going to settle here and we're going to glorify who? Ourselves, right? So that wasn't the desire of God, right? Tina?
Just to correct that point about, God made us all, we all come from one person.
Mm-hmm.
In Acts 17 and verse 26, he has made for one blood every nation of men on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So that specifically says he is faithful in one blood, all men.
Right, and it shows his ultimate rule over man too. He knows where people are going to go, and his will is going to be accomplished through that. But yeah, we're all from one, right? There's no reason to be discriminating towards anyone because of that. That's,
Sometimes people will say they're not like us, or they, whatever, but it says God made everybody, and he made us all from one
Yeah.
blood.
that's right.
So,
That argument falls severely short, so. Roger, were you scratching, or do you want to make a comment?
You want a blood transfusion, you don't have to find a white man to get your blood.
Right.
You can get
Anyone who has the type.
Who they are.
Right.
It'll work.
Or if O positive, you can take, I'm O positive, I think anybody can have my blood if you want, but, well, just ask. Let me put some kind of a restriction on that, maybe, so. Okay, so, did the first bell ring? Okay, so we got a couple minutes, I think. So we see their initial idea wasn't to glorify God, it was to glorify themselves and not to follow through with God's intention of filling the earth. So, in how would God have solved this problem, their problem for them? He's helping them to obey. So how did God solve that problem? He came down and confused their languages. So, when we want to work together, if we can't speak the same language, it's going to be super difficult. Even talking, maybe in different parts of the United States, how different we talk. Sometimes it feels like we're talking different languages, and it's hard to kind of get things going as efficiently as it should. But think about if your language was completely changed. You would want to congregate with those who spoke that specific language, or you could, at least from your family, move and work together. One question was in your book. It says in question 4, I believe, considering what verse 6 says about the power of unity, would this statement apply to activities for good as well as others? And going back to in Acts, in verse 6, it says, and behold, they are all one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they begin to do, and nothing now seems which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So really working together, they could do a lot. So what does that tell us about doing good? As a church, as a people, as a family, if we work together, right, we can accomplish a lot. If we work together, we have the same goal, nothing can stop us from doing God's will, right? If we work as a family here at College View and have all of our efforts pointed one direction, that's in serving, glorifying God, we can do anything to His glory. So anyway, thank you so much for your time.